Securing a Synology NAS is an interesting topic because the reality is you can really only follow a set of best practices which may or may not help you secure your Synology NAS. What we're going to do is break this down into two sections. The first is going to be a set of settings that you can configure that will help you ensure you're following some of the best practices. And the second step is going to be some data integrity protection. Now, the goal of this is to ensure that the settings that we configure help you ensure you're never going to have to use any of this data integrity protection that we're going to configure. But the data integrity protection is there in the event that any of these settings are incorrectly configured and you have to ever roll back. Now, obviously, as time goes on, there's going to be situations where you have to restore individual files, etc. But your goal is really to protect yourself from things like ransomware attacks. And if you configure this, the goal is to help you ensure that if that was to ever occur, you will have a full rollback plan that you can use to restore your data. So we are going to jump right into it. And the first thing that you have to do, a lot of this, just so we're clear, is going to be pretty basic stuff. We're going to kind of go through this quick. But the first thing you have to do is ensure that this admin account is deactivated. If it's not deactivated, you will get a bunch of pop-ups as soon as you sign into your Synology NAS that basically says that the admin account is enabled and it'll suggest that you disable it. So for most people, it will be deactivated. But if it's not, edit it and deactivate the account. Obviously, you want to ensure that you have a user account that is part of the administrators group. So you'll have to go through and create a user that has admin permission if you do not have that set up. But your goal is to ensure that the admin account is disabled because in a worst case scenario, the first user account that everybody's going to try and sign in with is admin. Now, the second thing we are going to look at is in the security tab. You're going to ensure that this protection for auto block is enabled. And this will just ensure that if X amount of login attempts occur within X amount of minutes and they're incorrect, that IP address will be blocked. It can be an internal IP address or it can be an external IP address, which we'll get to in a second here. But by default, you'll have users that fail this test go into this block list here, and any IP addresses will be here. So if you indirectly have a user on your local network that forgets their password and locks themselves out, you could always go back and remove them. You can also enable a block expiration, which will ensure that after X amount of days, IP addresses inside of the block list will be automatically removed. I'd probably recommend that you don't have this configured, but the point is you can if you want. The next thing we're going to take a look at is SSH. So SSH is used for a lot of different things, a lot of Docker containers. You have to go in and create a MAC VLAN network interface. So that could have been done in the past, or you might do it in the future. But the point here is that SSH is a very powerful feature that can be exploited if a different device on your network is ever compromised. So your goal here is really to turn SSH on and off when you are and are not using it. Now, I've read in the past where people say that disabling this is not a good idea because if you ever need to, you can access your device through SSH, and if you disable it, you can't access it. This is just my opinion on that, but my opinion on that is really if you're in a scenario like that, there are various other things you could do to get access back. So let's say you have networking issues. You could reset the network configuration. Let's say you have account issues. You can't log in. You can actually reset the admin account back to the default value if you have access to the physical device so you're able to access it. If you have SSH enabled and you have a device on your local network that gets compromised and they have, shell access and they're able to actually go through and attempt to SSH into other devices, and their goal is to access other devices through that compromised device, enabling SSH here and leaving it enabled will allow them to do that, while leaving it disabled will not. So the choice is yours, but I would recommend disabling it. The next thing is a quick one. We're just going to look at update settings. So you want to go in and you want to ensure that from an update settings perspective, this automatically install important updates is enabled. Now, you can install the latest update. I'd probably recommend that you don't do that. But the critical security updates should be installed automatically. This setting, I would recommend that you turn it on. Finally, we're going to quickly talk about Synology's Firewall. Now, I have the firewall on this test device configured, and I am doing a test at this point, which will be a later video, hopefully. And the thing with Synology's firewall is that there's two sides of this. The first side is that if you're not exposing your NAS externally, you don't have to use Synology's firewall. And when I say externally, I mean through port forwarding. You don't have to use Synology's firewall because no one will have a direct path to it. If you are using that, you really have to use Synology's firewall. I use Synology's firewall. This is my test NAS, so it's not configured here. I use Synology's firewall because it allows me to keep myself in check. So what I mean by that is if I go through and let's say I enable SSH, I want to ensure that I go in and I create a firewall rule for SSH so that I can access it. But I want to ensure that if I accidentally enable SSH for whatever reason, the firewall is going to block it until I go in and explicitly allow it. So that's mainly what I use Synology's firewall for. Now, there could be some downsides to it, meaning that you're going to have another layer that you have to check if you're running into issues. So there have been various times where I've configured things like Docker containers and they don't work. And the reason is because Synology's firewall is blocking it. So if you enable Synology's firewall, you really have to go through and ensure that you create allow rules for all of your services. And until you do, they're not going to work. But I do have a video on Synology's firewall, and I'm proud of how that video came out, so I'm really not going to go through it here, but I'm going to give you a very quick overview of how it works with a link in the description to that full video if you want to enable Synology's firewall. So with Synology's firewall, you basically have a few options here. By default, all interfaces is selected. I would probably recommend you do that. If you pick a specific interface, you can change rules for that specific interface, but just know that you have to do it for every interface. When you do the all interfaces tab, what you're doing is applying rules for all of your interfaces. So rules are configured from top to bottom. So what I mean by that is when they are run through, they'll be run through in the order of top to bottom. So in this case, we are allowing ports 6281 and 6251 to the source IP address 192.168.254.200. So your very last rule should really be a deny all rule. This was from my testing. But what I'll do here is I'll go through and then I will just create a deny all rule. So what this ensures is that when a service is attempted to be accessed, it's going to come in here, it's going to check. If it does not match this criteria, then it will deny the rule. But this would not be a good idea for us to enable right now because we're not allowing access to our management interface, DSM. So the very first service you have to allow is DSM. You must enable DSM and it must be above your deny all rule or you will lock yourself out. Now you can reset the network configuration on your NAS if you have access to the physical device. So, it's not like this is going to permanently lock you out, but you don't want to get into that if you don't have to. So your goal at this point is to really go through, if you want to use this, and pick specific services that you're using. So, for example, that 6281 rule, that was Hyper Backup Vault. I could go in and I could pick the specific service, or you can define the port manually, which I'll get to in a second. But one of the common ports that most people would use is this Windows file server. This would be for SMB. So I believe the SMB ports are 139 and 445. So until you actually create a rule for this, if you configured Synology's firewall, until you create the rule and you add it above the deny all rule, you will not be able to access your data through SMB. So when you configure Synology's firewall, you have to go through and configure these firewall rules based on whatever services you're using. I can't tell you what services you're using, but if you're using a reverse proxy server, you have to allow 80 and 443. If you're using SMB, you have to allow the 139 and 445 rules. If you're using any Docker containers, they're all going to be using different ports. You have to allow those as well. The way that you would allow those unique ports is just to define this custom section here and then go in and type in your custom port. You can also put a comma there, and you can define multiple ports, or you can do a port range. So what this would ensure is that every port from 8080 to 8085 would be allowed. Now, that's 8081, 82, 83, 84, and 85. Finally, this other section is just if you want to explicitly allow or deny traffic from a single host. So this would be an individual IP address or an entire subnet, which you can do as well, which would give access to the entire subnet. Finally, if you are exposing this externally, you can actually limit it by location. So if for whatever reason you are port forwarding the DSM port, which I would not recommend that you do, but if you are, or you're using a reverse proxy, whatever it is, you can actually go in and pick your country, and this would ensure that if you create an allow rule for that port, this would ensure that only that specific country can actually access it. Your goal with Synology's firewall is to limit the pool as much as you humanly can. So if you are really looking for internal access only, you can allow it for your entire internal subnet. If you're doing it for external access, you can allow it for your country, for example. Better scenario would be individual IP addresses, but a lot of the times that's not possible because of dynamic external IP addresses and stuff like that. But the point here is that Synology's firewall, you want to try and limit access as much as you can. Would I recommend that you do this? I would recommend it from the perspective that you are keeping yourself in check. That's why I use it. Will you see a ton of value from it if you're not externally exposing your NAS? No, probably not. But regardless, if security is on your mind, configuring Synology's firewall is an important step that you can take. And finally, the most important setting would be actually configuring two-factor authentication. So I have two-factor authentication enabled on this account. This will ensure that if anyone gets access to your password, they would still need that second factor to actually access it. If you want to ensure that everybody on your NAS uses two-factor authentication, you can do that in the security section and then in the account section, and you can enforce two-factor authentication. You will have to configure the email notification service, but the point is that you can do that, and then you can force either all of your users or only administrators to use two-factor authentication, and then you won't be able to sign in with an account unless it actually is utilizing that. Now, there are other settings as well. For example, I know that AFP has had problems in the past. There were some security risks. I want to say it was 2021 or 2022 with AFP and Synology devices, so you want to disable that. There are SMB settings you can use, which would, ensure that you're utilizing more secure SMB transfer protocols than less secure ones. But from a setting perspective, I would say that if you really configure the ones we just looked at, that will get you to a point where you're somewhat comfortable that your NAS is configured properly. Finally, we're going to switch over to port forwarding. So port forwarding is an interesting one because you want to ensure from a security perspective that no ports are forwarded to your NAS if you don't explicitly want them to be. UPnP can be configured to port forward on your behalf. So what you would do is come into this section and use this setup router section. And if you actually click start, what it will do is it'll attempt to access the gateway, which would be your router, and see if it can configure UPnP. If it can, at that point, you can actually port forward ports on your NAS to your router automatically. So generally, you don't want to do this. I'm running through this process, but you don't want to do this. This is a test network, so I don't care. But you explicitly want to port forward if you actually want to port forward, just so you know, one, how it's done, two, how to remove it if you really want to. If you have anything in this list, personally, I'd recommend you remove it, log into your router, and do the port forwarding there. That will ensure that you know what it is, know why you're doing it. Not having anything in this list doesn't mean that anything is not port forwarded. So if you want to check, you can go into Google and you can use any of these port checkers. I'm not going to say which one you should or shouldn't use, but it'll specify your external IP address there, and then you can test different ports. Generally, I'd not recommend you do it that way, just because I think you should log into your router and get an understanding of how it works. But if you want the quick and easy way of doing it, use a port checker to check to see if any of these DSM ports are open. Check for 5001. If it's open, you have a problem. Check for 5000 as well. Those are the two most common ones. If you've changed it, I have 6251 here. If you changed it, check that. Make sure it's not open. If it's open, you have to go and find out why. So doing that will ensure that you are only opening ports that you mean to open. That's the idea behind it. So at this point, we looked at a lot of the settings. Now, your goal with these settings is to ensure that you never get to the point where you have to actually restore from a backup or use snapshots, etc. But you have to configure snapshots and a backup in order to protect yourself if your NAS ever gets compromised. Now, the settings we just went over does not guarantee that you're never going to have any problems. We just checked a few best practices. What you want to do is have a rollback plan. So I'm going to mention this. This is not fully related to it. Get a UPS. I've said it 1,000 times in multiple videos. This will ensure that your NAS powers down in the event of a power outage. This will protect you against yourself. I'll leave a few links in the description. I have an article on why this is important. I will leave that in the description as well. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you need to ensure that you have one of these. Now that that's out of the way, we're going to take a look at snapshots and backups. So snapshots are your first line of defense. What I mean by that is in the event that some of your data is lost, you got hit with a ransomware attack, or if you just need to restore a file, you accidentally deleted it. I always use snapshots as the first line of defense. The way that you can configure them is by installing the snapshot replication tool, selecting snapshots, and then in each of these folders that you have here, going through and enabling a snapshot schedule. So I would recommend that you set it up to run daily, and then I would recommend a retention policy, and retention policies are tough because you can either set it for a set number of days. So because we set the schedule as daily and we are setting this as 30, this would ensure we could roll back 30 days. If you want to do an advanced retention policy, you can, and this will ensure that you can specify how many snapshots you want to keep based on hours, days, weeks, months, and years. So the only other thing to mention here is this immutable snapshots. Immutable snapshots are extremely, extremely powerful. Not all NAS devices support this. So you would have to have a newer one. I want to say like the 920 Plus. I think the 920 Plus supports it, but like the DS1019 Plus doesn't. So if you have a newer NAS, you will most likely have this option. If you have an older NAS, you probably won't. But immutable snapshots cannot be removed. Cannot be removed. Hear that out. That's an important thing because there are times in the past where I have gone in and deleted snapshots, and it's been for just really reclaiming space purposes. If you have immutable snapshots configured, you cannot delete any of this data. So where would I use immutable snapshots? I would use it on things like your documents. If you have a shared folder that contains all of your documents, I would go in and I would enable immutable snapshots because that would ensure that for, we'll say in this case, 7 days, the snapshot cannot for any reason be removed by you or anybody else. So if you're hit with a ransomware attack, and let's say a user had access to your snapshots and they knew what they're doing, they pull up your snapshot list, and then they go in and they remove all these older snapshots. Let's say you have an immutable snapshot here. Well, they can't remove it. That's the protection. But let's say I had 5 terabytes of data in this folder and I deleted all of it. Remember that snapshots will hold on to that data. So in that case, we have another 6 days and 21 hours where we will not be able to remove any of those snapshots. So immutable snapshots are awesome, especially from a data integrity and protection perspective, but you could get yourself in trouble with it. So you really have to sit down and think about your data. Think about how often it changes. Think about how large the files that you're adding and removing from it are, and then determine if you really want to use immutable snapshots. They are awesome, but they're not awesome for every single shared folder you have. So I can't tell you if you should or shouldn't use it, but that's how it works. As soon as you have that configured, at that point you have snapshots. So if you're hit with a ransomware attack and you wanted to, let's say everything in this media folder that I don't even know what's in it, but let's say everything here was removed, at that point, you would be able to go in and you'd be able to select the recovery, and you can recover that shared folder. And then at that point, you can restore from it and decide if you want to take a snapshot before restoring. But at that point, what you would do is you would see that your data is back. So that's how snapshots work. If you only lost certain data, what you can do is you can actually go into the snapshot folder itself and ensure that this make snapshot visible option is enabled. And then from there, you can go into this snapshot folder and you can actually browse the folders themselves. So if you have an individual file you're looking for, you can simply do that and restore it. You don't have to restore it on a bulk folder level. That's the power of snapshots. But snapshots are only valid if your storage pool is active, and for whatever reason the snapshots are still available, or for whatever reason they are not available, you would have to restore from a backup. Now, backups are interesting because I would recommend that you always try and restore from your snapshot if possible. If you cannot restore from your snapshot, you then have to go to your next step, which is backups. So you have to, one, configure backups, and you have to know how to restore from them. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is through Hyper Backup. Now, there's various ways to configure Hyper Backup. And with Hyper Backup, you can come up with your own backup strategy. So what I'm going to talk through right now is the data that you have that is the most important data to you. So this entire system option is new. Great option because it uses block level backups. The downside is you can only use Synology C2 and a remote Synology NAS device. So from a cost perspective, if you want to back up your entire NAS and do not want to pay cloud storage fees because they're going to be expensive, the cheapest option for most people is going to be to buy a second Synology NAS, assuming that you can get it somewhere off-site. If you can get it somewhere off-site and basically have a clone of your exact device, you will ensure that you will have a full backup of that NAS somewhere off-site, and it will be cost-effective, not right away, but over time it will be cost-effective because using Synology C2, if you have, let's say, 10 terabytes of data, it's going to be about, I want to say, $70 a month. So over time, that's going to add up. If you think about this in terms of years, you're paying, what's that, $840 a year for 10 terabytes of storage, assuming it never, ever goes over 10 terabytes of storage. So in 5 years, you're at over $4,000 that you spent. Whereas with a remote NAS, you get, let's say you spend $800 or $1,000, you just saved yourself, $3,000. So that assumes that you have a separate location, that you are willing to set up a NAS, able to set up a NAS, and willing to monitor it for, things like hard drive failure and security updates and stuff like that. For most people, you're going to use this folders and packages option. This is going to be because you are only going to back up your most important data. So I have a tutorial on how to use Backblaze, which is utilized through using this S3 storage, and it's a few additional steps. Synology C2 is easier to configure, definitely, because all you're doing is configuring your Synology C2 user account, and then at that point, you're just setting up a actual backup. And Synology C2 is actually better from a viewing perspective because it has a Hyper Backup Explorer built right into it. I will at some point do a Synology C2 review. But Synology C2, if simplicity is what you want, it's simpler than Backblaze. It's more expensive because it's stepped pricing. So if you use 1.01 terabytes of data, you are paying for 2 terabytes of data, whereas with Backblaze, you're paying, I want to say it's $6 a terabyte at this point. So you're paying $6 and a few cents In that scenario with Backblaze, you're spending, I want to say it's 14 a month with Synology C2. You are free to choose whatever option you want. There are other options as well. These are not the only options you're able to use. The point is you're backing up your data that is the most important to you. So keep in mind, you can use this local shared folder or USB. I wouldn't use a local shared folder, but if you wanted to use a USB, you could. And at that point, if you want to back up your important data to an external hard drive, you can do that. But the most important data on your NAS, which you would be devastated if you lost, you could back that up to Backblaze. And then let's say it's, 500 gigabytes. You're going to be spending $3 a month to back up that data. You'll ensure it's in a cloud location that is separate from your Synology NAS. And if for whatever reason you ever had to restore that data, you would ensure that you're able to restore it. They also have a bunch of cool features in terms of versioning, and if you have a ton of data and you had to restore 5 terabytes, for example, it would take you forever, but you could pay X amount of dollars to have that data actually sent to you on a hard drive. We're getting a little out of scope here, but the point is that Backblaze gives you a lot of flexibility, and you are able to ensure that your data is backed up in a cloud server location, and you can restore it if you ever have to. Now, I'm not recommending that you use Backblaze for any reason other than that's what I personally use. I don't have any affiliate links. I'm telling you that because that's what I use. But the point is that if you go in and I'm just going to show you this as an example, but if you go in and you start to set up Backblaze, which I'll leave a link in the description for, you can select your important data. So let's say in this media folder, only my movies are important to me, which is probably not a good example, but that's just what I'm going to use here. Let's say my movies are the only thing important to me. I'm not going to go in and back up that entire media folder. I'm just going to back up my movies, which then will ensure that they get backed up to Backblaze or whatever cloud server you're using. Now, from a hyper backup perspective, you are able to go back and actually view your prior backups. So this ensures that you can go through, and let's say you lost a file today or you were hit with ransomware 3 days ago and you need to restore. You can go back a week and you can restore that data. You can either restore individual files using the Hyper Backup Explorer option here, or you can restore an entire folder by connecting to that location, which will also keep your system configuration, which we're not going to look at today. But you can go in and then you can restore this data. These little warnings are here just to inform you that these folders exist on your NAS already. So if you restore the data, it's going to overwrite whatever exists there. But the point is, you can restore the data that you have from wherever it's backed up to. So like I said, snapshots first line of defense, backup second line of defense. If you follow everything here, what you're ensuring is that you're following some of the best practices from a settings perspective, but from a data integrity perspective, if anything was to happen, you will have snapshots and backups configured that you will hopefully be able to restore your data from one of those options. For Hyper Backup, I also have a tutorial for that I'll leave in the description in case you want to configure other Hyper Backup options. But the point is, with security, you unfortunately cannot guarantee that you're never going to run into problems. You're trying to get ahead of those problems and figure out a way to get your data back if anything was to happen to it. And data, integrity and security does not only, help in events of ransomware and stuff like that. It helps from a perspective of hard drive failure. Let's say, you're using RAID 5. You have 4 hard drives, you're using RAID 5. You get unlucky and 2 of the hard drives fail and your whole storage pool is toast. You are able to use the backups that you have to restore that data. If you don't have any backups, that data is gone. Can't use the snapshots because the storage pool is gone, but you have the backups. So when you configure stuff like this, you're configuring it following best practices, which do not guarantee you'll never run into problems, but help in the event that you do so that you can try and get your data back. So I am hopeful that this video helped you guys out. If it did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks, guys.